The city burned, not with the dramatic flames of cinema, but with a slow, grinding consumption, buildings collapsing inward, fires smoldering in basements for days, smoke hanging over streets like funeral shrouds. Berlin in late April 1945 was a landscape of destruction so complete that maps became useless. Streets disappeared under rubble, landmarks transformed into skeletal ruins, entire districts reduced to anonymous fields of brick and concrete dust. Major Thomas Brennan of the Office of Strategic Services moved through this devastation with the careful efficiency of a man who understood that survival depended on pattern recognition. 42 years old, lean from years of field work, he wore the uniform of a U.S. Army intelligence officer, olive drab wool, captain's bars pinned to the collar, a Colton 1911 holstered at his hip. His face was weathered, lined around the eyes from squinting through cigarette smoke and trying to read documents in poor light. Before the war, he had been a patent attorney in Boston, work that trained him to think in terms of technical specifications and hidden implications. The OSS had inserted him into Berlin 3 weeks earlier, dropped by parachute into the chaos of the collapsing Reich. His mission was specific: locate and secure documents related to the Arado AR-234 jet bomber program and its proposed successors. Intelligence suggested the Nazis had been developing advanced jet aircraft capable of carrying atomic payloads, prototypes that could revolutionize aerial warfare. As Soviet forces closed in from the east and American forces from the west, the race to capture German scientific assets had become as important as capturing territory. Brennan operated alone. The OSS preferred it that way in Berlin. Too many agents meant too many chances of compromise. He carried forged papers identifying him as a Swiss industrial engineer, Karl Weber, employed by a fictional machine tool company. The papers were excellent work, aged appropriately, with genuine Swiss stamps acquired through intelligence channels. His German was fluent, though his accent marked him as educated rather than working class. In a city full of refugees, displaced persons, and Wehrmacht deserters, one more foreign civilian attracted little attention. His contact in Berlin was a former Luftwaffe technical officer named Ernst Kessler, a man whose disgust with the Nazi regime had grown proportional to Germany's losses. Kessler had been a designer at the Arado plant in Brandenburg before the facility was evacuated. He claimed to know where certain documents had been hidden, not in official archives, which are being systematically destroyed or evacuated, but in private caches created by engineers who understood their work's value to whoever won the war. They met in the basement of a bombed-out apartment building in Charlottenburg, a district that had once been prosperous and was now a wasteland. The basement stank of sewage from broken pipes and the sweet, sick smell of bodies buried in collapsed structures. Kessler was thin, his Luftwaffe uniform stripped of insignia, his hands trembling from either cold or fear. He was 58 years old and looked 20 years older. Kessler produced a hand-drawn map, sketched on the back of a requisition form. The map showed a location in Tempelhof, near the airport, in a warehouse that had supposedly housed aviation parts. According to Kessler, a colleague named Heinrich Mahler had hidden technical drawings and prototype components in sealed crates, disguised as routine inventory. Mahler had been killed in an air raid 2 weeks earlier. Kessler was the only person who knew the location. Brennan studied the map, memorizing details. The warehouse was in the Soviet occupation zone. The Red Army had taken Tempelhof 4 days ago. Crossing into Soviet-controlled territory was dangerous, but manageable. What concerned Brennan more was the question of whether Kessler was telling the truth or feeding him misinformation. The OSS had taught him that desperation made people creative liars. He gave Kessler 2 things: a forged travel pass that might help him reach the American sector, and a cyanide capsule. Kessler accepted both without comment. They parted without shaking hands. Late April 1945. Tempelhof. The Soviet occupation of Berlin was organized chaos. Red Army units moved through streets with the confidence of victors, but discipline varied wildly depending on the unit's command structure. Some sectors were tightly controlled, checkpoints manned by NKVD troops who scrutinized documents with professional suspicion. Other areas were effectively lawless, occupied by soldiers more interested in looting and vengeance than security. Brennan crossed into Tempelhof at night, moving through rubble fields where buildings had been reduced to waist-high walls and piles of brick. He carried minimal equipment: the Colt M1911, a flashlight, a folding knife, and a canvas bag for documents. His Swiss papers were ready, but he hoped to avoid contact entirely. The warehouse stood on a side street near the airport perimeter, a two-story brick structure that had lost its roof to fire, but whose walls remained intact. Soviet soldiers had clearly been through it. The front doors hung open, and the ground floor was scattered with broken crates and discarded machinery parts. Brennan entered through a side window, climbing over the sill into darkness. He worked by flashlight, shielded by his cupped hand, moving through the debris. Kessler's map indicated the crates were in the basement, stored in a section marked as containing hydraulic components. The stairs were partially collapsed, forcing Brennan to climb down using exposed support beams. The basement was flooded with a foot of water, stagnant and foul-smelling. Crates floated and tilted against walls. Brennan waded through, checking markings. Most were labeled with standard Luftwaffe inventory codes. He found the ones Kessler had described in the far corner: 3 wooden crates stenciled with a hydraulics contractor's name. The first crate contained what it claimed: hydraulic pistons and valves. The second held the same. The third, buried under a canvas tarp and weighted with brick, contained something different: sealed document tubes, each marked with the Arado Company logo and dated between 1943 and 1945. Blueprints, technical specifications, test data. Also, small metal components, precision machined, wrapped in oiled cloth, prototype parts for fuel injection systems and turbine assemblies. Brennan transferred what he could carry into his canvas bag, selecting documents that appeared most significant based on their classification stamps. He left the heavier components. Retrieving them would require a vehicle and more time. He made note of their location for a potential recovery team. He climbed out of the basement just as voices echoed from the front of the warehouse. Russian voices, casual, not alarmed. A patrol or looters. Brennan moved to the window he had entered through and slipped out into the alley. The patrol passed without incident. Brennan waited 10 minutes, then began his return to the American sector. He carried documents that could reshape aerial warfare and represented millions of dollars in research. The OSS would be pleased, but Thomas Brennan never delivered them. May 1945. Disappearance. The official record became confused in the chaos of Germany's surrender. According to OSS files, Major Thomas Brennan was scheduled to report to the American military government headquarters in the Dahlem district on May 3, 1945. He did not appear. A search was initiated, routine for an overdue field agent in a city still processing thousands of displaced persons and POWs. No body was found. No witnesses came forward. His Swiss identity papers were never recovered. The Colt M1911 issued to him was not logged into any weapons depot. The documents he was believed to have secured never reached American intelligence archives. By June, the OSS concluded he had likely been killed, caught in crossfire, executed by Soviet forces, or murdered by German irregulars still operating in the ruins. His family was notified. His service record was classified and filed. The Arado documents became a footnote in the larger intelligence harvest of Operation Paperclip, the program to capture German scientists and technical assets. A few details troubled the investigating officers, though not enough to keep the case active. Several witnesses reported seeing an American officer matching Brennan's description in Soviet-controlled areas days after his scheduled report date. A black market dealer claimed a man with an American accent had traded weapons for civilian clothing and food. A former Wehrmacht soldier said he had seen documents with Arado markings being loaded into a Soviet military truck near Tempelhof. None of these reports was verified. Berlin in May 1945 was a city of rumors, where exhaustion and trauma produced unreliable witnesses. The OSS had more pressing concerns. The file on Thomas Brennan was closed. 1945 to 1960, the silent years. What happened to Major Thomas Brennan during those 15 years remained unknown to American intelligence. The truth, had it been discovered, would have required explanations that cut across the comfortable narratives of Cold War loyalty. The evidence suggested that Brennan had made a calculation in that Tempelhof basement, surrounded by the ruins of one empire and the emerging shadows of two new superpowers. He had understood, perhaps more clearly than his superiors, that the documents he carried represented not just military advantage, but leverage, the kind of leverage that could buy a different kind of life. Soviet intelligence operated extensively in Berlin during the final days of the war. Smersh counterintelligence units and NKVD operatives moved through the city, hunting Nazi officials, securing assets, and recruiting agents. They were pragmatic men who understood that ideology mattered less than capability. An American officer with technical documents and detailed knowledge of U.S. intelligence operations would be valuable. The decision, if it was a decision rather than a forced choice made under duress, would have been rationalized in various ways. The war was over. Germany was destroyed. The alliance between America and the Soviet Union was already fracturing. Brennan had spent months in Berlin, watching the Red Army's brutal efficiency, seeing how quickly the city was being divided into occupation zones. Perhaps he concluded that the Soviets would dominate Europe regardless of American intentions. Perhaps he believed the technical knowledge he possessed would serve peace better in Soviet hands than in starting a new arms race. Perhaps he simply wanted to survive and saw an opportunity. Or perhaps there was no choice at all. Soviet forces could have captured him, discovered the documents, and offered a simple proposition: cooperation or execution. Men under such pressure made decisions they would not have made in calmer circumstances. Whatever the mechanism, Thomas Brennan disappeared into the Soviet intelligence apparatus. The documents he carried were delivered to Soviet aviation designers, analyzed, and incorporated into jet aircraft development programs that would eventually produce the MiG-15 and other interceptors. Whether Brennan provided technical consultation or simply handed over the materials before being discarded was unknown. For 15 years, he existed in that gray space between defection and coercion, between treachery and survival. Soviet intelligence was skilled at managing such men, giving them enough comfort to prevent desperation, enough isolation to prevent escape, enough purpose to prevent suicide. 1960, the photograph. The photograph appeared in the files of the newly formed Defense Intelligence Agency in October 1960. It had been acquired through a CIA source in Moscow, part of a batch of images documenting a Soviet military ceremony commemorating the 15th anniversary of Victory Day. The photograph was black and white, slightly grainy, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. It showed a military parade reviewing stand, with Soviet officers in dress uniforms standing in a line. In the background, partially obscured by the officers, stood several civilians in dark suits. One of them was captured in profile, his face visible. The analyst who first reviewed the photograph almost dismissed it. Then he noticed something about the man's bone structure, the shape of his jaw. The way he stood with his weight shifted slightly forward. He pulled the OSS personnel file from Major Thomas Brennan, the one that had been closed in 1945. The man in the photograph looked exactly like Thomas Brennan would look at 57 years old. The photograph was grainy enough that absolute identification was impossible through visual analysis alone. But the resemblance was striking. The analyst ran the image through comparison protocols, measuring ratios between facial features. The probability of a match was high enough to warrant further investigation. The implications were profound. If Thomas Brennan had been alive in Soviet custody for 15 years, the intelligence damage was incalculable. He had possessed detailed knowledge of OSS operations in Germany, the identities of agents, communication protocols, and technical intelligence priorities. 15 years was enough time to debrief a man thoroughly, to extract every operational detail, to use his knowledge to compromise entire networks. But there was also a strategic question that troubled the analysts more deeply. Why would the Soviets allow Brennan to appear in a photograph at a public ceremony? The KGB was meticulous about protecting its assets. Allowing a defector to be photographed suggested either carelessness, unlikely, or a message. Perhaps Brennan was no longer useful, his knowledge outdated, and the Soviets were signaling his existence as a form of psychological warfare. Perhaps it was a mistake, an oversight in an operation that normally maintained perfect security. Perhaps Brennan himself had engineered the moment, positioning himself where a camera might find him, a desperate signal from a man who wanted to be found. Or perhaps the photograph was disinformation, a carefully constructed fake designed to suggest American intelligence failures and undermine confidence in the security of Cold War operations. Investigation. The DI assigned a small team to investigate the photograph. They began by reconstructing Brennan's final days in Berlin, interviewing surviving OSS officers who had worked with him, reviewing mission reports, and analyzing the intelligence priorities of 1945. They discovered that Brennan had been one of several OSS officers tasked with recovering German aviation technology. His specific focus on the Arado jet bomber program placed him in competition with Soviet intelligence, which had the same objectives. The theory that he had been captured rather than defected gained credibility. They also discovered that several other OSS agents operating in Berlin during the same period had disappeared under similar circumstances. 2 were confirmed killed. One had resurfaced in 1947 in Argentina, claiming to have escaped Soviet custody. One was never found. The pattern suggested systematic Soviet operations to capture or eliminate American intelligence officers during the chaotic final weeks of the war. The team requested additional surveillance of Soviet military events, hoping to capture another photograph that might confirm Brennan's presence. None appeared. The man in the 1960 photograph, if it was Brennan, was not seen again in public. They considered attempting to make contact through intermediaries, using channels that connected Western intelligence with Soviet officials who might be amenable to defection or information exchange. But the risks were substantial. If Brennan had defected voluntarily, approaching him might compromise other operations. If he had been coerced and was being monitored, contact could lead to his execution. The investigation eventually stalled. Without additional evidence, the photograph remained ambiguous, compelling but not conclusive. The file was classified and marked for periodic review. The unanswered questions. Thomas Brennan's story, if the photograph was genuine, represented one of the Cold War's more troubling mysteries. It raised questions that intelligence agencies preferred not to examine too closely, because the answers undermined comfortable certainties about loyalty, ideology, and the clarity of the conflict between East and West. Had Brennan defected or been coerced? The distinction mattered morally, but perhaps not practically. The intelligence damage was the same regardless of his motivations. Yet the question haunted the analysts who reviewed his file. Men wanted to believe that their colleagues would resist, would choose death over betrayal. But Berlin in 1945 had been a place where such choices were rarely clear. Had the documents he carried influenced Soviet aviation development? This question was easier to answer. Soviet jet fighters of the 1950s showed design elements consistent with German research from the late war period. Whether that knowledge came from Brennan's documents, from captured German engineers working under Soviet supervision, or from parallel development was impossible to determine. Technology transferred through many channels during the post-war period. Had Brennan tried to escape, to send messages to undo his choice? This was the most troubling question, because it suggested a man trapped in a decision made under impossible circumstances, living with its consequences for 15 years. If the photograph was genuine, and if Brennan had positioned himself deliberately where a camera might find him, it suggested a kind of desperate hope that someone would remember, would notice, would care. But the Cold War was not a time for sentimentality. The intelligence agencies moved on. Berlin became a divided city, then a walled city, a symbol of the conflict between superpowers. The ruins were cleared, the city rebuilt, and the desperate chaos of 1945 faded into history. Epilogue. The file on Major Thomas Brennan was declassified in 1995, 50 years after his disappearance. It contained his service record, mission reports, the investigation documents, and a 1960 photograph. The photograph was released to the public, appearing in several books about Cold War espionage. No definitive confirmation of the man's identity was ever made. Facial recognition technology, applied decades later, suggested a high probability of a match, but could not provide absolute certainty given the image quality. In 2003, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a researcher gained access to partial KGB archives. Among the documents was a file for an American technical consultant, no name given, who had provided information on aviation systems in 1945 and had been employed as a translator until 1962. The file contained no photographs. The consultant had died of pneumonia in a Moscow apartment, buried in an unmarked grave in a cemetery outside the city. Whether this was Thomas Brennan remained unconfirmed. The researcher noted the dates aligned with the photograph, but without DNA evidence or additional documentation. The connection was circumstantial. What remained was the photograph itself, a grainy image of a man standing in the background of a Soviet military ceremony, his face partially visible, his expression unreadable. It was the image of a ghost, or a defector, or a prisoner, or a survivor. It was the image of all the choices made in war's aftermath, when certainty dissolved and men navigated between loyalties that no longer seemed clear. Thomas Brennan, if it was him, had stood in that crowd for a reason. Perhaps he had wanted to be found. Perhaps he had wanted to send a message. Perhaps he had simply wanted someone to know that he had existed, that he had made impossible choices in impossible circumstances, and that he had survived them. The photograph offered no answers. It only confirmed that some stories from that time would remain forever incomplete, lost in the space between two empires, between two ideologies, between the man he had been and the man he became. The ruins of Berlin had been rebuilt. The Cold War had ended. But the ghosts remained, frozen in grainy photographs, their truths buried in classified files, their choices judged by people who had never stood in a flooded basement in a burning city, holding documents that could change the world and wondering who to trust. Major Thomas Brennan disappeared in Berlin in May 1945. A man who looked like him appeared in a photograph in Moscow in 1960. Between those 2 points lay 15 years of silence, and the silence told its own story, one of survival or betrayal, or something more complicated than either word could capture. The forgotten spy of Berlin remained forgotten, even after being found.